Hi everyone, welcome to Yoga with Heini. I'm Heini, and in this video we're going to go through the bridge pose in detail. The bridge pose belongs to the backbending poses family, but we can use the pose for other functions as well. We can use it to strengthen our legs, the feet, and also the core, and just that connection from feet all the way up to the torso. We'll come into the pose from lying down on the back. So bring yourself lying down so that you have your knees bent, feet are about hip width apart. They might need to be a bit wider apart. We can have a look at that just in a bit. But start from a place where you feel you can start to press down onto the mat through your feet. So you start to find some strength through the feet and legs. And from there, we'll lift the pelvis, we'll lift the back off the mat. So we end up with having our weight on the feet and the shoulders, the upper back. The pose is engaging through the back of the legs. We are using our buttocks, we are using our hamstrings to lift the pelvis up. But we also need to balance this action with our inner thighs. So what sometimes happens in the pose, we are using our buttocks, our glutes too much. So we're kind of squeezing the glutes towards each other. And what might happen is the knees start to open out because our glutes also rotate the legs out. And we might end up in a place where we're putting too much pressure into the lower back by squeezing the buttocks in too much. So then we want to keep the inner thighs engaged. So it's a balanced action through the inner thighs, hamstrings, through the glutes. And at this point, if you notice that it's difficult to keep the weight on the whole foot, so if it's impossible to keep your big toes, little toes, heels on the mat, if you find yourself kind of rolling the weight just to the outside of the feet, you might try stepping the feet just tiny bit wider apart and see if that gives you a better place to press down onto the mat through the whole foot. It is important to keep the big toes on the mat as well. So you might think about just slightly grounding a bit more through the inner foot. And we are not squeezing the inner thighs together. So our intention is not to have the thighs together, but just the idea of inner legs wanting to come towards the center line, but not touching. And when we lift into the pose, we can play with different heights in the pose. So you could start by coming into the pose so that there's kind of roughly straight line from your knees to your shoulders. So there's not that much back bending in the spine. Or if you want to explore going higher up, you could also start to lift your chest higher up. So in that case, your chin comes closer to the chest and you start to find more back bending in the pose. But if that creates pain, too much pressure in the lower back, you could always stay lower down. The basic variation for the arms is to have them next to the sides on the mat. But depending on your shoulders and kind of natural rotation in your shoulders, you might end up having your palms facing down to the mat. But if that feels that it's creating pressure in the shoulders, or you feel that you can't really use your arms, you can't really press down through the arms, try turning your palms up towards the ceiling, and that might give a different sensation, different kind of action in your shoulders. You might be able to lift the chest bone higher up as well. So there's no right or wrong where your palms should be facing. We have different options for the arms as well. One option is to walk your shoulder blades closer together, so you're kind of narrowing that space in the upper back. And you might bring your hands together, interlock your fingers, still pressing down through the arms. You're still using your arms,
And this might create a bit more of an opening in the chest, in the shoulder area. Another option would be to practice what I call the robot arms. So we bend the arms, turn the fingertips up towards the ceiling. And what this option might do is give a bit more possibilities to use the arms. You're pressing more down through your elbows, upper arms, using the arms to press down more. Still keeping the feet, the legs active as well. And one more option for the arms would be to bring them overhead. So lengthening arms overhead. And if that feels good in the shoulders, you might try that. But if you feel that bringing arms overhead creates pressure, pain in the shoulders, then leave the arms lower down. There are different ways coming into the pose and different focus points for the spine, actions in the pelvis, actions in the legs. Two basic versions would be to come up, kind of scooping the pelvis, rolling up through the spine and rolling down through the spine. So in that version, you would start by pressing the lower back on the mat, kind of scooping the pelvis up, and then vertebra by vertebra roll up through the spine to height that feels good for you today. And then coming down, you would start from your upper back. So do the reverse. Start from your upper back. Again, vertebra by vertebra, roll down until the pelvis comes back down, and then release back to neutral spine, neutral pelvis. A different way of coming into the pose, and this will train the core, the muscles around the hips, the spine in a different way, would be to find the neutral spine. So you have a little gap under the lower back and maintain that position in the hips, in the pelvis, in your back. And lift the pelvis, lift the back off the mat, maintaining the neutral spine until you start to come into more of a back bend. And then lower back down, maintaining more of that neutral placement, neutral shape in the spine and pelvis. So two different ways of articulating from the hips, from the spine. And one more quite interesting area to focus on when we come into the pose is kind of where we are sending our weight. I think quite commonly we're just thinking about lifting up, and then once we are up, we just continue lifting up and up and up, and that might end up putting pressure in the lower back. But we could also play with sending the weight towards the head, or kind of pulling the weight towards the feet, towards the knees. So I'll try to demonstrate. If we are in the pose, so we're lifted up, we could start to send the weight towards the shoulders. So we are ending in a more of a back bending situation. So we start to kind of gently push through the feet towards the shoulders, lifting chest towards the chin. So now I'm more gently pushing the weight towards the shoulders, thinking of increasing the back bend. But another way would be to start using the hamstrings a bit more, and I'm thinking of using my feet to pull the weight towards the feet, sending my knees towards the feet rather than pushing towards the shoulders, and it's a complete different action in the legs. I really start to feel the hamstrings working more. So sending the weight more towards the knees, towards the feet. So different muscular actions, different directions in the pose might give you different dimensions in the pose, and you might start to find a different muscular activation in your body. Coming in and out from the pose, we can breathe in several different ways. You could inhale, lifting up into the pose, and exhale, coming down. It's quite a common pattern. I prefer exhaling into the pose and exhaling out from the pose, just because I feel like it gives me a bit more connection to the feet and to the core. So exhale, kind of starting the exhalation when I'm still on the mat, and then exhale, pressing down through the feet, and with that control from the feet, from the legs, from the core, I exhale up into the pose. Feet, and with inhale while up in the pose, it gives a bit more opening on the front side, and then exhale, releasing back down and just pausing down on the mat to inhale again. So that would be more of like a vinyasa style, kind of moving in and out from the pose. But if we stay in the pose longer, just again making sure that you are breathing. It might be that it's a bit challenged to breathe in the pose, especially if you go deeper into that back bend. So just make sure you continue finding space for your breaths, and don't put too much pressure in the neck so that you're not blocking your throat too much. So you're not blocking your airways in the throat, so you can still breathe in the pose. But just again finding that edge where you feel the breath stays calm, the breath stays steady, easy. You're not straining your breath in the pose. And if you find yourself not breathing, you might be pushing the pose too far.
In bridge pose, blocks and a bolster might become quite handy props. And I'll show first a couple of different ways we could use the blocks.
And I mentioned the inner thigh engagement earlier, and for that the blocks can be really handy tools. I'm going to place 2 blocks between the inner thighs, between the knees, just because my blocks are quite flat. But if you have one bigger block, one block might be enough. So you can still keep your feet in a good place for your bridge pose, and then start to gently squeeze the inner thighs, the knees into that block. So you are waking up the inner thighs even more. And then lifting up into the pose so that the block or blocks don't fall down. So you keep gently squeezing into that prop. And that might be a really nice way to wake up and remind yourself about the inner thighs. Another way of using a block or blocks would be under the feet. So I'll bring my blocks under the feet, and this gives a bit more space to lift up into the pose. So it elevates the floor, and I feel a bit more space in the back when I can press down onto the blocks. But in this similar way, you could use a bolster. So instead of using the blocks, you could bring a bolster under the feet. Again, it just gives you a bit more space to lift up into the pose. Just be aware that the bolster might move a bit more than the blocks. So you might need to kind of mold places for your feet on that bolster. But it's the same idea. It might give you a bit more space to lift up. And then one more way we can use both the bolster and the blocks would be to make your bridge into a supported variation. Now again, if you're doing a vinyasa class, it might be that you're just visiting the bridge pose. There might not be enough time to start moving the blocks or the bolsters around, but especially if you're doing a bit longer bridge, for example in a yin class, or even a slower hatha yoga slow flow class. One way would be to start with a bolster under your legs and lift up into your bridge, and then pull the bolster under the pelvis. So now we release the pelvis down onto the bolster. We're using less action, less muscular action in the legs. But what this might do is, well, first of all, it gives us a bit more time in the pose. Also, we might find a bit more release in the lower back area. If we're doing a dynamic class, I would still suggest keeping some activation in the legs. If it's a yin pose, We're going to do complete relaxation, but I'll talk about that in a different, more yin-focused video. And in a similar way, you can use a block. So I'll push that aside. So we could lift into that bridge and then bring a block under the pelvis. So again, coming into the pose, depending on the size, the shape of your block, it might be that you use it in an upright shape, or you could bring it under the pelvis as a very flat block. But again, the idea would be that the block, the prop, would take more of that weight, and you might find some more release again in the lower back. You still want to keep the activation in the legs if it's a dynamic practice. But those are a couple of different ways you can use props in your bridge pose.
Bridge pose is one of the more gentle, more accessible backbending poses, and you can quite easily monitor how deep, how far into the backbend you go. So quite many injuries can accommodate to the bridge pose, but just be aware of any lower back injuries or just kind of general, achiness, tenderness in the lower back. And if you start to feel there's a lot of pressure in the lower back, just stay lower down. You don't have to go really high up, or try having a very low block under the pelvis, supporting the pelvis, and focus on the inner thighs. Again, remember not to squeeze the glutes, but you balancing the action with the inner thighs. And be aware of any shoulder niggles, injuries. It's not really a big pose for the shoulders, but just if there's an arm variation that hurts, feels bad in your shoulders, then try to choose a more gentle option. Often the basic variation where the arms are next to the sides is very accessible for shoulder injuries as well. And then one more thing is the neck. So if you know there are neck injuries, if you have really stiff neck, or you don't really like putting pressure onto the neck, then again, don't push the weight towards the neck, towards the head, but keep a space under your neck when you're lying down, and don't kind of squeeze your chin to your chest. So keep the neck free in the pose. And even for pregnancy, the bridge pose as a backbend is quite safe pose. It's quite early on in the pregnancy, backbends that we do lying down on the belly become a no-no. But bridge pose we can practice much later on in the pregnancy as well. But again, we just need to be cautious how far into the pose we go. So don't think about opening the belly area too much. Take it more as a pose where you're strengthening your feet, your legs, you're controlling the core, rather than pushing high up into the pose. But as always, if you have injuries or medical conditions that you're concerned about, always talk with your medical professional before practicing the pose. If you have any questions, any thoughts about the pose, just leave a comment below and I'll answer your questions and we can chat further. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. If you did, click subscribe and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of any new videos. I'll be posting lots more yoga related videos on this channel. I also teach online yoga classes, and if you're interested in those, you'll find more information in the description box below and on my website. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.